sticking it out to the end. I am not a coder. I'm not an artist. So I think I'm unique amidst the speakers for that reason. I have a background in math and work currently for an artificial intelligence research company. I'll tell you guys about that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about art from a critical perspective, an aesthetic perspective. So I thought it would be neat to close the conference and, as opposed to demoing, stuff that I'm working on, sort of step back and put a lot of the stuff we've seen over the past couple of days, and actually I'm just going to focus on style transfers, but putting one aspect of what we've seen over the past couple of days in context to start to build out a critical aesthetic framework to think about the new art that we're working on at this conference. So I work for a company called Fast Forward Labs. We are an applied research company focused on machine learning and data science stuff. So what we do is every quarter we pick out algorithms that we're interested in because we feel like they're shifting from being interesting from a theoretical and academic perspective to be ready for prime time and commercial production. And what we do is we build prototypes. So that one that you can see on that screen is there's actually the first prototype we built. It automatically writes real estate ads based upon structured data that you can input into the system. So it's natural language generation technology. And then once we built the stuff and we've really played with it and gotten our hands dirty and grappled with the tech, we write reports that describe what it is, what the history is, who's working on it, if there are vendors in the space who are working on it. It could be sort of also cool artistic projects with it. And then we have a sort of how-to guide that teaches data scientists and engineers how to build it. So our customers get access to the source code in our prototypes so that they have a formal mathematical tool to support their projects. So ended up at this space because the last two projects we've worked on are in the neural network space. So we did a report, just to show you guys what they look like. They're letterpressed at this cute little place in Brooklyn. They're cool. We did one on convolutional neural nets for image analysis and build an app that you can hook up to Instagram, and it tells you what you take pictures of. It was trained on ImageNet and then affiliated with WordNet from the semantic perspective. It makes really interesting mistakes, like my CEO takes pictures in the New York City subway system a lot, and ImageNet does not have grid training data for the New York City subway system, so it likes to call it correctional institutions. So you learn that we feel so bad every day because we're basically in jail when we go in. ImageNet doesn't have any pictures of people. And women on Instagram really like to take pictures of their babies, and they show up as Band-Aids and neckties. So that's cool. We just recently finished a project on text summarization, which is actually about stuff that Allison was working on, word-to-vec, skip thoughts, and using recurrent neural networks to render text, vectorize text data, and then render it computational in some way. So the computation we decided to focus on was extracting out the sentences that best represent the content of larger documents. And we found that recurrent neural networks are currently at a state where they're pretty good on one document, but if you want to do multi-document summarization, that's a lot harder to do. So we just used a relatively older technique called latent Dirichlet allocation that does topic modeling to try to get insights into multi-document sets, but we'd like to push that forward. So after those insights, to sort of shift back to the focus of the talk. So I'm going to talk about style transfers today, and the question that I want to ask is, this is a quotation from a research paper in 2014 that classified paintings historically based upon the style that it saw in their images. And they have the first sentence of the paper says, deliberately created images convey meaning, and visual style is often a significant component of image meaning. So what I hear, when I read this, I think content and form, right? So what is depicted and how it's depicted are intrinsically linked with one another. In painting, we like to think about things that way. And the meaning of what we observe depends upon that intrinsic linking. So then we get into the style transfer world, and actually one more thing I forgot to mention in the preface. I'm going to talk about, from a critical perspective, work of people who are in the audience, and mostly Gene Kogan, and that's weird. I used to be a literary scholar, and I've only a couple of times seen people actually describe someone else's work when they're present, and I actually think it's a really wonderful ethical posture for us to have towards past works, as opposed to just considering it's like dead material that we can throw around, and you'll see my talk is really about that. So speaking about someone who's here, I think will intone what I'm about to speak about, because it's going to be about past works and what we do with them. So meaning and content, meaning derives from this intrinsic connection between form and content, and then we get this, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 6 on the bottom, so there's 10 different Mona Lisas there. And obviously the form is a lot different from what it was originally intended to be. So the question that I'd like to pose is, a couple of things. A, what does this new style mean? And then B, what's the essence of the original, right? What's maintained from the original when we perform operations like this with this new code? Okay, so to think through that, I'm going to walk us through the critical framework I want to use. Comes from an essay from 1936. If you haven't read it yet, it's totally worth reading. It's sort of a hallmark of critical theory by a Frankfurt School philosopher named Walter Benjamin, called The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So Benjamin was a kind of tortured dude. He was a Jew in the early 20th century. He was persecuted. He lived to write. He actually, when he fled Germany during the Second World War, he had this briefcase that he brought with him, and that was all he really cared about. And in this work in 1936, it's kind of a Marxist manifesto, and it's oriented towards helping the populace think through propaganda and think through what art was that in that day. But there's some interesting concepts that are still very valuable for us. The picture on the left, it's another sort of, hey, this is cool, you should go check it out, is a film from 1929 called Man with the Movie Camera by Dziga Vertov. It's an early film when film, it was just possible to start to actually make movies, and he's super meta. He's thinking about it in a very meta, abstract way with regards to how their perception of the world was changing in the advent of this new technology. So Benjamin starts off his essay and he said, art has always been reproducible, just not at mass scale. So to walk through these concepts, I thought there's an exhibit going on right now at the Victoria and Albert Museum about Botticelli, and it's all focused on this, the birth of Venus, so this authentic original painting. So Benjamin says, look, reproduction has occurred, right? So there's this one image from around 1482. We look at it, there's what we see visually, and then it's also loaded with all sorts of meaning. It's allegorical, it's representing things that are probably silent to us these days because we're not, I assume most of us in the audience aren't super well versed in mythology and the relationship between these various characters and the way that they showed up in Renaissance paintings at the time, the way they were related to the literature at the time and what this trope meant. 1877 comes along, and this sort of staunch, kind of boring academic painter, this is an age where the Impressionists were coming along and there was more experimental stuff going on, but you still had people that were reproducing paintings. And you see there in the background, there's that, the columns, right? So these ruins where in 1877 versus in the late 1500s, when one picks up a classical image like this, there's this notion, there's this representation of decay that's communicated there within. But the moral of the story is, people have been reproducing paintings for a long time. So Benjamin says, but not in a way such that we take that image of the Botticelli of Venus and take a picture of it and make as many copies as we want, so they can be distributed out, across a population. And he says, originally, this paintings like, it's a little bit before this, but there's this notion of sort of mysticism and ritual in this particular image. So Benjamin says, art arose out of a means to have some symbolic value of an image that could connect together a community, a religious community, and it functioned as as a token of ritual, and therefore the one object in the one church, it had this essence and aura and identity that was part of what it was. And if we abstract that out and suddenly it's not just the one painting that's in the one church at the one time, but it can end up in your home and it can end up all over the place, it loses that uniqueness in some way. And that's unfortunately, as per Benjamin's take, that's not necessarily a bad thing. He calls this the dependence on ritual parasitical, and says, the cool thing, and also in sort of an anti-aristocratic way, is when it goes from just a couple of people can own these prized objects to everybody can, we can sort of shift the value to something more political. So in this Botticelli exhibit in the Victoria and Albert, just thinking about the way in which reproductions of image could become political, this is an example from Yin Xin from 2008, where she, as a Chinese woman, says, all right, we've got this Western ideal of beauty, and I don't look like that, and I will reimagine, reproportion this. and reproduce it in such a way to make a political statement just through that transfer of form. And then Benjamin says, and when art is reproduced, it loses its aura, so it loses this specialness. So, Warhol is sort of, in my opinion, the apogee in the mid-60s of the artist who's thinking about mass reproduction and the extent to which the value of individual objects is basically depleted. And the focus of art shifts from intricate detail and the rarity of talent that goes into generating one thing to thinking critically about the status of a commodity within a culture. And I did this is really funny, you guys will see this. If you look for what you can find, reproductions of Botticelli's Venus today in commodity capitalism, you can buy these pained version for your wall, you can buy a keychain, you can buy a bottle opener, you can buy a pillowcase, you can buy a shower curtain, which is my personal favorite, you can buy a t-shirt, and if you have lots of money, you can buy a Dolce & Gabbana dress, right? So art loses its aura. And can sort of fall into the realm of kitsch. And John Berger, another cool book, if you haven't read it yet, that's really seminal for thinking about sort of oil paintings and plastic arts in the 20th century. This is post-Warhol came in and sort of took Benjamin's logic and pushed it to the fore. And he said, what the modern means of reproduction have done is to destroy the authority of art. For the first time ever, images of art have become ephemeral, ubiquitous, insubstantial, available, valueless, free. They surround us in the same way language surrounds us. What matters now is who uses that language for what purpose. So I think for me, the question with regards to style transfers is, let's assume that these old objects of art, like the Mona Lisa, like Van Gogh's Starry Night, etc., are insubstantial, available, valueless, and free. And we have a choice with regards to what we're going to do with them and for what purpose. What can we do? So it's interesting to see. I'm about to shift into answering that questions, but interesting to think through the extent to which I think style transfers are different from mechanical reproduction before. So this is Warhol in 1962 taking Marilyn Monroe's photo and using silkscreen techniques to just reproduce one particular photo, of course, in the color palette on the left and then the black and white on the right. And this, in 2015, is Kyle MacDonald taking a different image, obviously, of Marilyn Monroe, but going back to our Botticelli painting in the left and grafting the style from different paintings throughout, highly recognized paintings throughout our art history onto one particular photo of Marilyn Monroe. And the thing that sticks out to me is that in the age of mechanical reproductions, where silk screens are also sort of a more mechanical technique, it's like stamps that you just do over and over again, what sticks out is sameness. And here, there's always variation and difference. So there's sort of, in this algorithmic reproduction, much more multiplicity. So what can we do with it? So we can use, I want to propose old images and use art and art of the past to explore a new technology. So going into deep neural nets, Mike Tyka talked about this a little bit yesterday, but they're really hard to understand. They're deemed uninterpretable. So I work with a lot of regulated industries in my job, and they're not really able to be adopted at this time by financial services companies or healthcare companies for certain reasons, because you don't know why the classifier is doing what it's doing. If we take the example of the Microsoft net that has 152 layers, it's like on layer 75, it may have discerned a feature that is now determining why we're deciding if somebody has breast cancer or not, right? So those are things that make you squeam a little bit, and they should make you squeam. So, and also it's, a lot of people they're not data scientists or mathematicians, and yet they're going to be using this technology. And it's helpful to have some sort of concrete way to grasp that layer 72 is doing something different from layer 73 with regards to more abstract features and up to more highly composed features. So, as Mike Tyka just talked about yesterday, and I don't want to repeat what he said in too much detail, but nets and the linear algebra and sort of matrix math that goes into these things are a great tool for adapting to the fact that visual data and music data and sound data, but in a different way, in a much harder way, are inherently composable. So as we look, and this is an image from one of our reports, this is my colleague Grant, who put himself through Deep Dream, and on level 3, it's picking out these geometric, very sort of abstract features. Level 4 starts to think that Grant looks like a cat, And then at level 5 is sort of, continuing to add on that, the greater levels of structure. And the key insight that Gaddes and his colleagues had in their paper in September of 2015 is, okay, so if different layers in the network are focusing on different elements of an image, it's possible for us to abstract form from content, right? To sort of use these things and pick out the layer that is encoding style versus the layer that's encoding what the object that's represented. So once that insight is there, so basically from how are we using Starry Night to help think through technology, this helps this was a key insight that discerned some of these features of these layers, and then also can be used as pedagogical tool going forward to help people understand them. So what interests me as I look through the selection of images that people working on style transfers include either in their research papers or things that they present online is they don't just take, let's say, Starry Night and take an image of the house in Tübingen, as in the example that's in the original paper, and only present the second already transferred style. So you don't get only that large image on the right. You always, and in nearly every instance, get the original painting followed by the transferred image. They're always coming in pairs. So here's the example in Gaddes. Here's Justin Johnson, who takes Frida Kahlo, who takes Renoir. I don't know who that circle guy is. Somebody gets points if they recognize it. The crystal ball one. Okay, cool. Thank you. This is Gene, who, and it's technically a little bit more difficult to go into the video space, but he takes the originals of Picasso, takes the Klimt. And then this is an earlier, example from Kyle's page that has style transfers. And it's really cool if you look through it, it's just this almost history of art as grafted onto Marilyn Monroe and then that landscape painting. So thinking back to Benjamin and sort of, what is the status of the original in this form, in this technique? So there's a couple of things that I'm proposing, and I haven't, I'm just sort of thinking through this now, so I could be wrong, and that would be great. And if people were like, this talk sucks, I want to think about this more critically. So I think with regards to, the status of the original, the authority of the original, I feel like, people wouldn't pay as much attention to it if it wasn't the sort of the assumed mastery of the Frida Kahlo, of the of Munch, etc. That seems to be the mastery of the artist that goes beyond science and algorithms. That then to sort of as a rhetorical tool to push the value of AI is like, hey, we can actually like uncode this and put it somewhere else, is sort of one way. So it's sort of like a champion of the surprising rigor and virtuosity of the technique, as well as, hey, we can get people to pay attention to this and we can also, I think, because these easily could have been just photos photos are hard because of the way the style's spread up, but paintings that are not masters paintings could also be grafted onto images. But I think it helps to discern what's transposed just from a visual and optic perspective from the original onto the new one when we use these images we're almost overly familiar with. I think what's interesting is that the new style, especially when it's shown in these sort of sequenced images, is relational. So it's not that there's something, the Marilyn Monroe after style transfer has any intrinsic value, or the original one, the intrinsic value of the original one is sort of degraded because it's transferred, but there's this new thing that's relational between the two that arises in that act, especially because they're always paired with one another. And then the third is thinking about, as I touched upon this a little bit before, so why is this different from mechanical reproduction? When Warhol does 1,000,000 Marilyn Monroes, there's a little variations, but they're more or less the same. Here there's always multiplicity, right? Because we have our recipe, but we're applying it to different images. And, I'm relatively, try to be really grounded with regards to the capability of emerging AI algorithms, and we're not at the point of full creativity, but we can sort of mistake it for that. And then the other thing is, when we thought about when he was talking about consumer culture and sort of the multicast world of advertising in the 60s, where you had the image of, pick some sort of the sexy woman that's grafted onto every billboard across the United States, and everybody sees that same thing. Everybody sees the Venus, and it's the same. here I think when we think about even what capitalism has become today in the world of algorithmic filtering and Facebook and personalization and tailored advertising, we see that these style transfers per Picasso, right, the consumer apps that's out there, this is not the same image reproduced over and over again. This is people personalizing it and having a little bit of activity in the consumer world to sort of graft it onto their own space. But it's like, it's cool to be like Van Gogh, so it's not the same, it's personalized. And I think that there's something important about that as we think through how old art works within current contemporary capitalism. Okay, so step one. What else can it do? We can use art to bring new technologies and old skills to a larger audience. So pulling on this Picasso example, there's a lot of hype about AI, and I put up these as 3 examples of articles that I find somewhat, well, the third one's not misinformed, but the first 2, this was an article that came out in Wired, soon we won't program computers, we'll train them like dogs. It's like, it's a horrible article. I recommend you read it just to sort of read about how people that aren't actually working with code are describing what AI is today, and it's off. The doomsday invention is a little bit more interesting. It was in the New Yorker last year. It talks about Ian Bostrom, who's a philosopher at Oxford. This is a paradigmatic example of AI as like sort of existential threats, and we need to be concerned with Skynet within the next 3 years, and that's the ethical posture we should be considering. It's sort of pushing the risk to the extreme, as opposed to, statistical algorithms tend to propagate existing biases in data sets, and when they're thrown at credit information that could affect people's lives, they have real consequences today. So I personally am biased towards thinking that those are more important ethical questions to ask than thinking about when AI computers become smarter than us and kill us. But this is the way. This is what sells, and is interesting to people. And then the third, this bottom one, is relating to X.AI. So I've been at a ton of conferences where there's a lot of energy around chatbots, and people think that they're super smart and they're already ready to automate out everything. And X.AI is training its systems using people that aren't paid that much to gather data, and people don't know that, and they should know that. And I feel like we have a responsibility to make sure they do. So Picasso, right? So it's enabling this larger populace to play around with this technology without needing to have technical schools, which is super cool. I think the language that they put on their website is interesting, just as just sort of taking a critical glance at how they're marketing this to people that they don't assume know much about how things work. It's most interesting at the end where I say, sometimes it works and it's awesome, sometimes it doesn't work at all, and to be honest, we're not really sure why it works. So it's interesting to see that as a nascent field where we're not really sure how to interpret these things yet, how that then gets propagated out. And then I think it also, in the public consciousness of these new technologies, there's a tendency to overestimate what algorithms can do. So this is Kyle. When he first got his hands on this tool, he was like, this is awesome. We can sort of reconstruct, we can reverse engineer style to figure out what Van Gogh actually looked like when he painted this painting. And he tried it, and it was like, man, this doesn't work. So he ended up instead finding this photograph from a guy named Tadeusz Cern called Revealing the Truth, where he doctored a picture to look like Van Gogh, and Kyle ran it through, posted this tweet, it got picked up, people were like, whoa, what did you do with your algorithm? Well done as usual, etc. There was some other, when I did searches on it, there's still existing articles where people say, and it's still like reported in the news, that Kyle did something that he didn't do, because as he says in his Medium article, it's like, we need to be careful about the perceptions people have of this technology. So just the other sort of warning sign out there. And then I think something, and this is my listening to Mike Tyka yesterday, who had sort of some philosophical ramblings that I found interesting, and I thought I'd ramble a little bit as well. We can use past art, to study our own intelligence through machine intelligence. So at the end of the Gaddy's article, they make a really interesting and exciting claim. So they say, all right, style transfers arose because we were trying to solve a problem to do image object recognition. So we were training systems with the explicit goal of classifying images per tags that are, what's in those images, dogs, cats, this is a dog, this is a glass of wine, this is that. And as they did that, they're learning their networks. They ended up being trained in such a way that, in order to perform this function, the network had to become invariant to any variation that didn't preserve the object identity. And that variation, it became practical statistically and architecturally to pull out style, what we call style, so as to say what something was, to map to our semantic categories. And then they say, and this is something to be tested, but it's really cool, that our ability to appreciate style in the first place could be a corollary of the inference capacities of our visual system. So our very ability to look at the manifold of stuff in the world and categorize it into objects requires that we leave information out to sort of see forms. And then, and then we become sensitive to how we then use what we've cut out in other, in other contexts. So I think that's cool. The other question I think is cool is, when we look at this sequence of 11 Mona Lisas or 10 Mona Lisas, they're all different, but we still know it's the Mona Lisa. So, if this is not the Benjaminian question where the aura is like where the painting is, what it's lived through, how the paint is degraded over time, but rather, what's the minimum viable Mona Lisa, right, if you will? So what is it, and the German, this Gestalt theory, is there what element of form is required for us to need it, and where could maybe it would slip out of the boundaries of recognizability from a content perspective. Oh yeah, the other thing that I thought was cool that I want to mention in Jean's thing is the one on the far right is actually Google Maps. So it's not only, famous stuff and the Rosetta Stone, et cetera, it's also contemporary stuff that we see every day. Kant has something to say here. I'm not going to go into that, I just know that it does. The other thing is, Kant says, that's why it's in parentheses. Kant also said that we are unable to actually perceive things as they are because we as humans are trapped within these bodies, and therefore the form of our cognition is in terms of time and space. And there's a really cool paper that just came out in April by Lake and Tenenbaum where they say that what's missing from deep nets and what makes it so that they still need so much data to actually come to do pattern recognition and differs from human intelligence is they lack intuitive physics, so children very easily, start to have a grasp of if they put one more block on the Jenga tower, it's going to fall. There is a group at Facebook under Adam Lehrer, I saw a talk last week, that's working on training nets to be able to predict when a block will fall from a static image. So they're sort of working on that from a data-driven perspective. They lack intuitive psychology, so it's hard to tell what an agent's gonna, intends to do. They lack the ability to sort of build models that easily generalize to predict causality, and they lack the ability to learn how to learn, which is pretty complex, but it's basically generalizing upon past instances. We always have to retrain a net when you can transfer some text, but you have to sort of retrain whenever you get a new data set. And then last point I want to bring out is, that's really interesting for me, is at this conference I was at, Yoshua Bengio was there, and he and I were talking a little bit about if we're trying to sort of move to the next step in using neural networks to get greater intelligence over image classification tasks, how can we sort of go from, I can point out that this is a dog and this is a cat, to having more general inference-like computation from the nets. And what he pointed out to me that I thought was interesting, and this came up in Mike Tyga's talk yesterday too, is that it's actually not statistically efficient to set up, to gather together features that are discerned from these things in terms of the types of categories we use to create hierarchies to classify, different types of animals and entities in the world. So for example, if you look at WordNet, you'll see a breed of a dog, which is a domestic animal, which is, a mammal, and it goes all the way up the chain until you get to the first mover, totally abstract entity things. So that's not the way in which the networks are often sort of organizing their information that they abstract from features, which is one of the reasons why, deep dream makes the crazy type of hallucinations that it does, right? So horizons tend to give towers and pagodas because in their space, they're sort of like these two types of representations are in sort of a similar, they're in a similar vector space as you know, and they're farther away from the way in which language is sort of semantically decoding things. So I put the image on the left there from Magritte because we assume, because it's our habits and it's our practice every day, that there is some sort of, once again, this like intrinsic link between the names of things and then the objects of things. But that's not there. The linguistic system is very arbitrary. So I think, and this kind of goes into what Allison was talking about, there's incredible poetic possibilities in what we deem to be classifying mistakes in our thinking about how we organize features in the world to sort of make sense of things that I find also super cool. All right, the last thing I want to put up has nothing to do with my talk, but I just think it's really neat. So there's this guy, Charles Lebrun, from late 17th century. I used to do a lot of work on this in this period when I did my graduate degree. And like, it's like deep dream before the fact. He was doing these studies on character and believed that different people's like moral stance, right, their ability to be like nice or kind or mean, was affiliated by their spiritual connection to animals. And he did all of these studies that were like, we can trace people's physiognomy back to their connections to different animals. And there's hundreds of them. So it's, I don't know, when Deep Dream first came out, I was like, whoa, it's like this guy that I know from the 17th century. So I just wanted to show that because I think it's cool. And then sort of, okay, so what's the point of my talk? As Benjamin said, the way we made art in the past differs from the way we make art today. And therefore, I think our critical notions of what art is must adapt and stride with new art forms. I think it would be great to have a community sort of working on that alongside the community of artists. I think how we see past art influences how we create future art. So if we were to have sort of continued to deem the Mona Lisa some sacrosanct object that we couldn't touch, we wouldn't have style transfers. And then I think the other thing I want to sort of warn against is, Benjamin said, you know, the ritual is gone, the cult value of art is gone. But in the late 19th century, they had this movement that was like, you know, as photography came up, they said, well, can we make art that's just for art's sake, right? And sort of abstract it from the political. A little bit of what I see often in these discussions is like tech for tech's sake. Like it's like exploring, it's fun, we can create beautiful things, but it can often be about exploring that as opposed to sort of thinking about some of the larger ramifications. And I don't know if that's a problem, but I think it's something that is there and worth looking at. And that's it. That's all I have to say.
Any other questions?
This might be a little rambly, but I don't consider myself an artist, but my brother's an artist. He's a painter, and I was talking with him about how things like machine learning could work into his practice. And there are two things that we were kind of debating or struggling about when we were talking about this. One was this issue of being branded, or I don't know, I guess branded a machine learning artist when you dive into this type of work, and how your perception at large kind of gets like tumbled or like washed away in this like stream of this pursuit of tech in a way. So I don't know if there's any thoughts that maybe that you have about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a paper by, it's a Medium post by Blaise, I don't remember his last name, but he's like working on the Deep Dream team. And he talks about how there's still in our culture like this, and I think even the way, if you go to a university and it's like there's the STEM disciplines and then there's the art disciplines, and there's a couple of programs that are more interdisciplinary, as you know, with what's going on at NYU, et cetera. But I think there's like, we still tend to think that there's the tech people and then the non-tech people, and therefore, you know, there's like this, it's going to be culturally assumed that if you use that term, you'll sort of be pegged as one or the other. And I don't know ways to sort of get around that immediately, but I think that it's just like it's these cultural bulwarks that are real. And I think also in terms of like on the art side, you know, I spend a lot of time mostly with financial services companies, insurance companies, and just like the big sort of, you know, money-making institutions of the world. And they're open to understanding how creative, you know, they're open to what's going on in the research community, and they're open to what's going on in the art community, if you can bridge the gap and then translate how that then matters for them. And that's not quite an answer to your question, but I think it's like there's more interest in it than I would have anticipated.